Karlov Manor's deeper than you think.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Durdle Maniacs. If you want to be a Durdle Maniac, go to patreon.com/EternalDurdles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show.
Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blechman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, I've been hearing a lot of people talk down Karlov Manor as like the least impactful or influential set in a long time, and I think they're wrong.
Yeah.
I think
I'm interested to hear what your take is on this. Before we hop into the meat of the podcast, I wanted to just quickly we haven't been on for like a week. I'm working on this PowerPoint presentation for MagicCon Chicago. So if you're in MagicCon Chicago, definitely check that out. Saturday at like 5:30, I think is when it starts. It's a retrospective on 30 years of Magic media with Morrow. So definitely check that out. But that's why we haven't had the constant episodes that we normally have. We're looking to start ramping up again as we get more funding. And obviously, that always I have to shamelessly say, we got to thank all of our Patreon supporters for that, because that's definitely helping us outsource some of our editing and stuff like that. And we're looking for editors right now. Just things that we can do to make it a little bit easier to get the podcast out to you. So that's where we are right now. I don't want anybody to think that we're like slacking or we're going to stop anytime soon. There's just been a small lull in time. That's all. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
Yeah, but like that when in March when you actually go and get to do that,
It's this
panel,
week.
it's going to be
this Friday.
This week. Sorry, yeah, it's the end of February. Yeah, it's going to be so awesome. Like I'm so hyped to get to watch the back end of that.
We're gonna have a lot of content coming out at the beginning of March, basically.
Yeah, it's gonna be sweet.
So I think that all comes down to the support we get from our viewers and our sponsors.
And also, this episode is also coming out right before Fallout previews too, and who knows what kind of insane nonsense we're gonna get from that. I don't know any of the Fallout lore, but friend of the pod, Joe Dyer, he's going to be doing a rundown of like the flavor of every. He's a big Fallout guy, so he's going to give some flavor lore as to like why the card is designed the way that it is designed when they come out. And so I'm going to be frequenting his Twitter to get the rundown on like why everything is, because I will not be catching up on the actual IP.
Joe has the same amount of lore knowledge in Fallout that I had in Lord of the Rings, so you do well to follow him wherever he's posting his lore drops. I'm super excited for Three Dog. I don't know if you know who Three Dog is. He's the DJ in Fallout 3. So if they put out a Three Dog card, I'm into that, because it's like Three Dog says, Phil, when two dogs aren't enough but four's too many. Three Dog. Ow, ow.
You can't argue with that. It's pretty straightforward.
Right? So anyhow, let's talk about Murders at Karlov Manor. You have some takes. One of them is the card Deduce, but you said there's a lot more than that. This set's looking deeper than a lot of people are giving it credit for.
Yeah, so I've been, ever since the set came out, I've been testing Deduce in Miracles. Now, I have an analogy for, my Miracle homies out there, all me and myself. And, but like, I'll explain like why Deduce has been powerful, even like more powerful than it seems at first glance, because I think just Investigate as a mechanic, previously the best thing that we saw with Investigate was Tireless Tracker. And I feel like during Tireless Tracker's pedigree, before, it got power crept out by everything, but like back in its heyday, when it was like coming out of sideboards, when it was like maybe a one or two of in like grindier mid-range decks, I remember that it always seemed like, oh, well, landfall get a clue, but then you got to spend the mana. But because it attacked on multiple axes of being a powerful card advantage threat and also like, you know, being able to, you know, combat like
It's a beater.
it was a beater, but it was also taking away from like ulterior game plans, right? Like people had to respect like the combo or of like a lands deck while also respecting this individual threat. And it reminds me very much of like when you play against like Cephalid Breakfast, when they play a Stoneforge Mystic, well, it's like now you have to respect this like fair beatdown plan. And Cryptic Coat, by the way, is showing up in Stoneforge decks and a couple of other things. That seems to be one of the cards from Karlov Manor that has been a hitter for people. But I think that in ways that are not obvious, there's a lot of potential for people to continue exploring Karlov Manor. They may not take the time, considering that there's going to be new Fallout cards and we may get something busted. But my experience with Deduce, at least, has been that it is exceptional. And here's an analogy for anybody who knows that I've been a Predict Miracles guy forever, right? So 4 counterbalance, Predict Miracles guy, that's who I've been for a very long time. Now, I hope that this will translate to the archetypes that people play when they look at other cards. But a lot of the play patterns when I played Counterbalance Predict is if I have a counter, like if everything is going to according to plan, I can stick a counterbalance, I do a terminus, I sweep the board. We're in this sort of holding pattern on an empty board, but I have a counterbalance, right? Like that's the only thing on the table. And I'm not otherwise applying any pressure to you. And you have to now navigate around this counterbalance. What ends up happening in the Predict Miracles variations is Predict Miracles is a very good counterpuncher. If I have a counterbalance and we're in the ring, we're boxing, and I'm exceptional at counterpunching. But Predict, in order to see the top card off the counterbalance and convert itself, you have to act. I have to wait in the center of the ring for you to come to me. I got to draw you out, and then you do something, and then I can counterpunch, whether that's like with Fetch Mystic Sanctuary shenanigans, Predict in the interim, doing something of a cantrip off of the counterbalance trigger. Like there's a bunch of different things you can do, but Predict is stuck until you act. Whereas Deduce, if we're in that same holding pattern of counterbalances on the table and we're otherwise jockeying for position, now if you pass the turn, instead of me having to like sandbag this Predict and wait for you to come for me, I can Deduce in that holding pattern. And that analogy when we're boxing is like, now I get to start pushing you into the corner because I still have a cantrip on top of the deck or on board off of the Investigate, the clue token. So that also stacks extremely well with multiple counterbalances. Again, I get to apply more pressure by stacking multiple counterbalances in the same way where like you can interact between the 2 counterbalance triggers. The clue just sitting on the table is also very good. It's the clue itself is better with Mystic Sanctuary because if you Mystic Sanctuary something back to the top, like a terminus or something, and then need to convert that terminus, that's not as good with Predict because then you have to like target the opponent to mill to draw the card. Whereas with the clue, you don't have to do that. So Deduce has been really exceptional. The other thing that's been very good with Deduce is that like if you didn't have the setup cantrip on turn 1, you just get to Deduce on turn 2, and now you still have the clue just sitting on the table. So it being card advantage over multiple turns, still quite good. Everything about the card that I've tested since it came out, I've played 4 Deduce Miracles since it has come out, and it is the truth. Like my deck may be bad, the strategy may be bad, but Deduce is good. Now, can it be good elsewhere? I mean, it's better than AK. It's in my experience so far, it's been better than Predicting that it doesn't need setup required, right? So it's easier to convert. It's not like with AK where you need 2 copies to make it good. Like Deduce is just 2 copies of AK off the top, It's just been very smooth, and I've appreciated it greatly. Now, there are other aspects of that I think are better than we think from the last 2 sets. I think there's a couple of things. So in Murders of Karlov Manor, Cryptic Coat has made the rounds.
Yep.
Also hop in anytime. I feel like I'm monologuing.
No, you're good. I was actually just waiting for you to get to Cryptic Coat because that's one that I don't think we really covered too much. We might have mentioned it, but we walked right past it.
Well, I think Cryptic Coat, everybody's been comparing it to True Name Nemesis. And I think the closer assessment is that it's way closer to Batterskull. Because it being the threat that you can pick up and put back down means that it just gets through any amount of creature removal. Because like no amount of creature removal will be good enough, right? Like as long if the game is going long and you're not getting locked or comboed in some way, getting to pick up the coat and put it back down is just way better than like a TNN that you can't interact with. Because even though the cloaked creatures have ward too, like you can still get through that, right? Like in a long game, in a grindy game, you can get through that. Playing against many a Kappa Cannoneer, if we're in a developed game and you Kappa, I don't care. I'm just going to spend 5 mana and remove it, and it's fine. Kappa was only devastating when it came down on like turn 2.
Yeah.
So in a similar way, I think
get followed up on turn 3 with another one.
Yeah. So in ways where people are like, oh yeah, we can play it like True Name, and it's like sort of. I think that like you put it in your if you're playing it with Stoneforge Mystic, I mean, great. I don't know if you need to because it's still a cheap enough threat at 3 mana that pitches. Yeah. But the fact that like it works with your cantrips to like clear the top of the deck, you can sneak creatures in. I played against Breakfast at the 2K over the weekend, and I had Counterbalance floating, and it was pretty clear that I would be able to counter a 2-drop, and he can never actually convert his Illusionist into play. But he I let a cantrip go through because I wanted to be able to ensure that I wouldn't get comboed off, but he Cryptic Coated to sneak his Illusionist onto the board to then next turn what's it when you uncover it off the disguise? You just morph it.
That unmorphing.
You turn it face up.
Turn it face up.
So when he turned it face up to get through the counterbalance, which was like, oh, that's like a cool shenanigan. It was the first time I had played against Cryptic Coat.
Yeah.
But like the powerful part of Cryptic Coat wasn't that, oh yeah, it was putting off Stoneforge Mystic and that's good. I mean, it's good because it can get it in uncounterable. But like the powerful part was just like, okay, we've developed, and now you need to expend some amount of resources, and you expend them by just picking the coat back up and down.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it reminded me very much of the old days of like Stoneforge Mystic Batterskull, where like you could just plop the Batterskull down, and then as long as you held up 3 mana, you knew that you were going to be able to outgrind your opponent because you could always just pick up the Batterskull.
Just bounce it back, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Have you played against Cryptic Coat or with Cryptic Coat at all yet?
I've not. It looks super interesting just because, yeah, the ability to bounce it back to your hand. I think we really underestimated how good this card was based on the fact that we were just like, who's going to spend 3 mana to make a deck to make this work? And it just turns out that this does everything you need to do all by itself. Like, you don't have to build around this card. You can just throw it into your deck.
Yeah, I think it being, if you're not really competing for slots, like if you want to condense how many creatures, condense your threat base, that you can do it. And it's like, if you then spend your counter magic or whatever to like protect it coming in, it can then protect itself on the board by A, not caring about actual creature removal, and then B, against stuff that would try and clip it, you can bounce it back. But you get into the space where it's like, oh yeah, with Batterskull you had to spend 3 mana, so it could be dangerous if you fear getting blown up in response to getting it picked up. But at 2 mana in a really developed game where you're just grinding, it's a lot easier to be like, okay, 2 mana, pick this back up, and then still have 2 mana up to protect it again if they try and fight over it that way. So it sort of condenses that play pattern down. And then, even though it doesn't have lifelink to pick up, it is a bit more aggressive, right? Like 3 mana unblockables are pretty aggressive. And when you pick it back up, when you pick up a Batterskull token, if that ever happens, the germ would die. Whereas with Cryptic Coat, you just still have the 2/2 with Ward 2, which, pretty solid.
Yeah. 2/2s with Ward 2 are fine. Obviously, for free. I wouldn't, land my entire game plan on that. But the fact that it leaves it there, it is actually kind of the big thing, because like
I think that
getting in. Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that the caveat of thinking of like, oh, a 3 mana 2/2 with Ward 2 is not, or a 3 mana 3/2 unblockable with Ward 2, maybe not playable in Legacy. But if you think about it as it's the like after that first one, it's a 2 mana, or it's a 3 mana 2/2 with Ward 2 that draws a card, and that draws a card just happens to be Cryptic Coat. Like if you think every single time you do it, you draw Cryptic Coat. That's like, if every creature in your deck draws Cryptic Coat, then all of a sudden that's pretty good because every single creature draws a card. And if you're just grinding, then it's like, ETB draw card is really good.
Yeah, I mean, there are games where you'll get to that point where you have 5 mana and all you really want to do is just keep, putting this in and making more, going wide, as it were.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting card because it's not something we've seen previously. Like, not exactly, like you were saying Batterskull, but like this is so much like, there's no lifelink, but this is so much more resilient than Batterskull, and also just having it in your hand isn't the end of the world. Like when you draw Batterskull and you're a Stoneforge deck, you're like, oh, that was not what I wanted to. I wanted to get something. I wanted to get this from my deck, not from just drawing it.
And to the extent that you're like, it's more resilient than Batterskull, it's because it's literally 4 mana cheaper total on both ends, right? Like you spend 4 less mana. Your threat maybe isn't as good, but like a 4/4 isn't necessarily where it's at anyway. Yeah. Lifelink is where it's at, right? Like that's really the part of Batterskull that's great. But like if you're in that space, like I think that Cryptic Coat, like everybody has acknowledged that like Cryptic Coat is a player from the set. It's not like going to overhaul the format or anything, but it is the card that I think, again, I feel like people like scratch the surface and then haven't really delved into like where it's actually optimal, which I think is like, we are going to just like, you want to trade resources. You want to trade. And then Cryptic Coat is going to be the thing that's inevitable, right? Like Cryptic Coat is inevitability. Yeah. And that's really where I think like, I've seen people playing Stoneforge Mystic, like, old school, like Stoneblade decks with Cryptic Coat. I've now seen Cryptic Coat with in Breakfast, but I've only seen it attached to Stoneforge Mystic. And I don't even know if you even need the Stoneforge Mystic.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you on that. I don't know that Stoneforge is where you want to be. And like, it's fine. Like if you want to add this to your deck, great. But I don't think that this is a card that needs Stoneforge Mystic. And that's kind of what I was getting at is like, when you have a Batterskull in your hand, even if you get it through, Stoneforge Mystic and your opponent kills the Stoneforge Mystic, you're just like, great, that's terrible. This like is castable at 3 mana. It feels, if somebody counters this, that's fine, I guess. But just continuing to recast it, eventually you're going to get to a point against at least a slower deck, where they're gonna have to decide what they want to do about the Cryptic Coat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's also the interesting part that like Cryptic Coat can clear chafe off the top of your deck, right? Which also leads me to believe that it's better to just be in like a harder control deck as opposed to just a mid-range deck, because actually getting to manipulate your draw, even though it's a clunky way to do that, but if you're trying to get to that board to begin with, that like, okay, 3 mana clear chafe off of a cantrip is still pretty solid. Like it sounds like a lot, but like you get to pick and choose these spots because Cryptic Coat only costs 2 to pick up. It's additional blue cards whenever you need it. Like, in the late game, if you're like, oh yeah, I can sandbag this Force of Will, and your opponent is like, how many cards do you have? And you have 1, but like the Cryptic Coat threatens to be your blue card. So it's like,
that's actually pretty interesting there too.
It's very subtle. It's like a lot of subtle things, but I think that's what I'm talking about with Karlov MANOR is like the stuff that like this comes out. It's not just, oh, obviously it just has to be in this thing that we've only ever thought about always because like, oh, it's an equipment, gotta have it with Stoneforge Mystic. I just don't think that that's the space necessarily, because Stoneforge Mystic can never pick up the coat. The coat doesn't have an equip cost. You know what I mean? So like, I think in that space, it's just like, the other thing that I was thinking of, like, how deep can you go? I played against a Phyrexian Dreadnought deck with the Gatekeeper. It was just mono white Dreadnought. Yeah. And, Urza Saga and, you have the bunch of things. You're already, like, pre-boarded against Doomsday and Initiative because you're playing all of these effects that, make it so that it's Gatekeeper Thrall, right? Or something like that.
Gatekeeper Thrall is the name of the card.
That's called, That card also, I think, in ways that is pretty interesting. Now, that deck that I played against, it had a bunch of chafe in it that I think if that was cleaned up, then that deck becomes way more powerful. So some of this, the chafe was like, it was playing like Oswald Fiddlebender. I don't think that's a legacy playable card. But everything else about the deck of like between Hushbringer and Gatekeeper Thrall, okay, those are the stuff that's turning on your Dreadnoughts. But then you had Urza Saga, which can fetch up the Dreadnoughts with these, 2 mana flyers that don't die to Bowmaster. Okay, we're heads up there. It's that space, like that shell, and it was playing the land.
Getting to put a Dreadnought in off of Urza Saga is just bonkers, disgusting.
Yeah, right. And you make a bunch of power, and then you tutor it out, and you make more power, and it's like that shell, that condensed shell. Particularly like this player that I played against. It's on camera. It's on 90s MTG. We have a game that's on there.
Link below.
It was also playing. It was playing, what was the land that can copy Dreadnought that we talked about when it first came out?
Oh my god, Mycosynth
Gardens? Yes, right? Is it called Gardens? Yes.
We'll go with Gardens.
Yeah, it's one tap copy an artifact.
Yeah.
And so we were talking, it's another way to like, copy and make dreadnoughts. And Urza Saga is inherently powerful to begin with and can make dreadnoughts. And you have these shells, and I'm like, if you just put yourself into that space of, if you can only be in mono white, but if you replaced Fiddlebender with like, I don't know, any amount of interaction, then all of a sudden that deck looks pretty solid, right? Like, even if it was like protection spells, because like you're a tempo deck at that point. You're making 1 mana 12/12. So like, I think that like, that space, I think that deck could be a really cool, interesting new like Urza Saga deck. That
it's also interesting because with the gardens, right? The gardens, it does tap to work, but you could do this EOT, right? With your, if you have, let's pretend you have enough mana. You could EOT, get out your Dreadnought and turn the gardens into a Dreadnought, and then untap and attack for the kill.
Yeah.
Which is kind of ridiculous.
The deck can be fast.
Yeah.
And also, speaking of, like we were just talking about Cryptic Coat, you can Cryptic Coat your Dreadnought.
Exactly.
Put it face down.
Yeah.
Turn
That's
it face
where
up,
I thought you were
right?
going with this actually the whole time.
But it is. But like, I mean, I don't know the whole thing of the build. Like, can it support 2 colors? Like, maybe you lose the Gardens, then that's fine. I don't know how effective the Gardens actually is. But like in that space, it's like, okay, well, if you play Cryptic Coat, and then if you're in white, and it's like, okay, maybe there you want Stoneforge Mystic because you're already playing the Shadow Spear, so like there's additional incentives there. But like now we're playing with all legacy power level cards. But like that's what I mean by the exploration. I feel like the exploration has only been, okay, first glance, there's the mono white Painter deck. What if we remove the Painter, added in the Dreadnoughts and the Gatekeeper Thralls, and see how this plays out? But it's like, we can, with every list so far, that whether it's Cryptic Coat lists, whether it's this Gatekeeper Thrall interaction, there's, I want to talk about Case of the Filched Raven. Case of the Force of Filched Raven. I'm gonna be playtesting that card. I'm very hyped.
Well, a card that we mentioned and we were pretty hype on initially, then we realized that it wasn't as good, but has still shown that it's very good, at least in Modern, is Leyline of the Guild Pact.
Yeah, Leyline of the Guild Pact has just made Rainbow Rhinos, which is, you play the Leyline, and then on turn 2 you can cast your Scion of Draco. And it's all colors, and so it has all of the abilities that it grants, which is like Hexproof and Flying and First Strike and Trample or whatever. I don't know. It's literally all of the abilities, right? So you just have a 4/4 with all the abilities, and it's very good. And you play it in your Beans deck, and it draws a card.
Yeah.
So
hey, the extra Leyline still pitched to Force of Will, so it's an interesting choice for the deck. I play with Scion of Draco in Modern. I have like a zoo deck, but the Leyline of the Guild Pact with Scion of the Draco is something I really didn't think of at all, and it's just wild how like good how good is a Tarmogoyf if it has all of those abilities? Like it gets much better. We go from a card that wasn't playable to a card that's very playable.
Yeah, I think like Leyline being good. It's just like, oh, was the free spell good? The 0 mana effect was good. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
of course.
That's where it's like I feel like everybody recognizing Leyline and it exploding in price or whatever. It's just like it feels like the most obvious because obviously the free thing is the best card. But
so it's Vigilance, Hexproof, Lifelink, First Strike, and Trample. Ooh.
Pretty good. Yeah, pretty good.
Yeah, that's quite solid.
One thing that like we haven't talked about is Proseidetic Memory, the enchantment that draws cards.
I actually wanted to ask, has anybody played that?
Well, I know that we've talked about. I feel like that card is actually still underplayed. What it has shown up in is Riddler, the Riddler combo deck.
Oh yeah, okay.
Because the whole thing is you draw your deck, and then that thing draws a card. You're doing nothing but drawing cards with Riddler, and so by the time you hit your attack step, you can either pump a guy and then attack for lethal, or you can just suit up your Walking Ballista.
Yeah.
Move to combat, put all these counters from all these cards. I draw my deck, however many times, make my Ballista a 40/40, shoot you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we didn't think of that when the spoilers came out, but like, that's shown up, and that's really good, right?
Yeah. trying to see what were the other cards that you mentioned the Raven, the case of the Filched Falcon. That's what it was.
Falcon, case of the Filch Falcon.
Filched Falcon. So this is 1 blue mana for a case, so sort of like a class, but you have to solve it. When it enters, you get an investigate, so you get a clue token. Then you solve it if you control 3 or more artifacts, and then if it's solved, you can pay 2 and a blue to sacrifice this and put 4 +1/+1 counters on a non-creature artifact. It's a burn flying.
Yeah, so one thing to note for this, which is why I think it's interesting, because I think clues are underrated. I think just having draw cards sit on the table is really powerful. So I've been very impressed by Deduce. And so that made me think, okay, what are the other effects that just incidentally put a clue token on the table? Because having draw a card just sit on the table is really powerful, at least in my experience as the control mage. And so having this as a 1-drop, I was like, well, 1 mana of, virtually draw a card, right?
Yeah.
So it's 1 mana virtually draw a card. You just get to choose when you draw it. So like you get to hold up mana and do it when it's convenient. But the upside of, okay, Metalcraft to solve, and I already want to be in the Deduce space. So it's like I'm going to be making several clues, but I'm not looking to end the game necessarily. I'm looking to control it. And then I want to be able to turn the corner, but I want my win conditions to be incidental. And one thing that I've routinely found as I've been testing Deduce is I have a bunch of 10-2s in my deck. Now, 10-2s are what I refer to as like cards that are either a 10 or a 2, depending on the matchup. And those are usually better situated as sideboard cards. You want like very consistent like 7-8s in your deck always in your main board, right? When you're like, and that's always the tricky part about a control deck, because you have white cards in your deck that against combo don't do anything. And so you try and use your cantrips as ways to like draw the correct half of your deck to mitigate that. But what I'm thinking of when I was looking at Filched Falcon is, okay, Metalcraft will be incidental over time, right? If you're making enough clues or doing, Mishra's Baubles or whatever, you may incidentally just be able to solve the case. Cool. That's incidental because you've already gotten the investigate token off of the ETB for 1 mana. Great. To solve and making a 4/4 flyer off of whatever that is, if you put it on the clue and make it a 4/4 flyer, well, now that clue's a beater. If your opponent ever wants to interact with that 4/4 flyer and try and remove it, you can sack it. I looked at this specifically. Clues don't need to tap. Yeah. So you can attack, and if they try and remove it, whatever, I'll draw a card, right? Like, all of the play patterns here are really, really nice of being like, this is incidental, and if you interact with it, whatever. And if you don't, whatever, right? Like, we love that. We love that as the control mage. That was the whole Baleful Strict. That's a Baleful Strict syndrome, right? It was always excellent. Like, interact with it, great. Don't interact with it, great. It's doing its job. It drawed a card on ETB, same thing here, right? It investigates on ETB. So I'm like thinking about it in this space of like, oh, this is like a 1 mana Baleful Strix. I get that it doesn't trade, but it can make a 4/4 flyer, which can be relevant against certain things when you need to block, like, the DRC or the Delver in the air, right? So like that's not bad when we get to that space, after the game is developed somewhat. It's finding the right numbers. Like, this is where I need to test, is like, how effectively do I need to get to Metalcraft? I'm thinking it similarly to like DRC players thinking, how aggressively do they need to get Delirium? But it also keeps the curve lower, right? It's another 1 mana cantrip. Like everything about it that we didn't think in spoilers, right? Like, I didn't think of these things of like, what does this actually look like, until I played with Deduce and was like, oh, these clues are actually sitting on the table is really powerful. What else sitting that like does something similar? Filch Falcon is just a 1 mana version of that happens to also be a threat. And so I'm going to be experimenting with this, in the next several events that I play in. I'm going to test out Filched Falcon, and that's where, when I'm reading everybody writing about on Twitter or on other podcasts that I'm listening to, that Karlov Manor is not as impactful, I'm thinking it's not just as openly, obviously impactful. Yeah. We're not getting the Orcish Bowmasters that's like, oh yeah, clearly, obviously, this thing is broken. Like, very clearly, everything about the card is good and does everything good in exactly the way that you think it's good. You don't have to.
The most subtle part of that card was that it wasn't a named character.
Yeah, it's
you had to actually look at it,
Yeah. So like, in that regard, I feel like Karlov Manor is not giving us a bunch of cards that are just very obviously, openly broken in the way that we've gotten from a lot of the past several sets, where it's like, clearly this is a legacy card, obviously, right? There's a bunch of cards that I think are good role players that can be impactful if they are given any amount of support, that are not even asking for a lot, to be totally honest, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that they are just good cards on their own, but they're not very openly, obviously good cards. And then where they are obviously slotted may not actually be the best home for them. So it takes a little bit more homework, a little bit more practice to like find where they might be best situated. Cryptic Coat's a great example. And I feel like as we're talking about it, there's probably cards that I'm not even seeing in Markov Manor still that are better than we think, that just haven't gotten the time of day because they haven't been experimented with. You know, it's similar, cards that like stand out to me that are seeing a bunch of play that didn't before a while back, that were like sort of fringy, was like Witherbloom Command. I'm seeing the Sultai decks, and Witherbloom Command seems like solid, awesome staple 2 of in tier 1 top deck. And that's it seems like a role player, but like when it first came out, it's not like it was a slam dunk.
Well, even Assassin's Trophy was like that. We weren't talking about Assassin's Trophy until like a year or two later.
Yeah, I've been like looking through the Karlov spoilers again, just to see like, okay, what did we miss? What are we not looking at? Because there's so many things where it's like, if you just tack Investigate onto it, you just you lower the or you raise the floor of what's playable because it replaces itself.
Yeah.
Like, there are so many cards that just say draw a card on it, but they're disguised under the word Investigate, and so you don't actually see it in the play pattern in the same way if it just said draw a card. But if you looked at every Investigate card and just actually swapped the word Investigate out and put draw a card in, like, how do we actually evaluate those cards? And it's totally changed how, like, when they go back and do Investigate it again in a future set, like, I will be looking at it with entirely different eyes, because it's way better. Like, I get that you have to pay 2 mana, but it's like, it's way better than meets the eye, I feel like.
I think another thing to keep in mind also is, like, I didn't look super close. Like, I look at all the rares. I always look at all the rares, all of the mythics, of course. But I don't go deep into the uncommons. That's generally where we miss things, is in the uncommons. Famously, I think, what was the one that was like, oh man, I should have picked those up, and then it became, that's a story for every set, honestly. Like, I'm just like, I wish I would have picked those up. But the cards that I think are kind of going to be sleepers here are the collect evidence, because that is just a metric that I'm not sure that most of us are willing to do the mental math on. And every now and again, I look at a card like, let's look at Cryptex, which is a mana rock. And it's 2 mana for collect evidence 3, tap it, add a mana of any color to the mana pool, and put a unlock counter on Cryptex. Then you can sacrifice it and surveil 3 and draw 3 cards. Which, I mean, look, we don't need mana rocks in Legacy, not that produce 1 mana. But this is interesting because getting to, like, getting an effect out of a card that you wanted anyhow, and then drawing 3 later on, like, that's something that, like, we really didn't discuss. And for what it's worth, that's collect evidence 3, so that's 9 mana in your graveyard over the course of a couple of turns that, like, you just had to remove from the game. That can happen. That doesn't seem that crazy to me. I wouldn't play this particular card, but, like, I'm saying, like, the collect evidence thing, I don't think we looked into hard enough, and I bet there's something out there that collect evidence is actually pretty good.
Yeah, and also collect evidence will only get better as they give us, like, these, like, really heavy cycling cards that are always thick fatties that you just get to put in the yard. And
look at Troll, right?
That was always the enabler, right? I remember there was a long time ago. We had talked about the collect evidence. I think it's collect evidence 8, and it's essentially the 1 green mana you can tutor a land or a creature.
Yeah.
So there's the version of that that's Delirium, where it's like you can search for a basic, but if you have Delirium, you can search for a creature or land. And there was a while back that people were playing that with Tarmogoyf and Death Shadow as, like, threats. Their threats up to 12, so they would have 12 threats, even though they only had 4 Shadow and 4 Goyf.
Yeah, that was Traverse the Ovenwald.
Trurus the Uvengold. So let's
Analyze
see if
the
we can
Pollen
find
is the card we're talking about now.
Analyze the Pollen. Yeah. So Analyze the Pollen. I know that we had talked about it, and we just did what everybody else did. It feels like, as we just looked at, like, oh yeah, it's it's another one of those things that, like, seems like it's good, but like you just sort of need the investment. But it's like, I don't know, like, if you don't want to play the Scam Reanimate package, you can still play Troll, which is fine as just like a way to lower your land count, and then enable this thing on the cheap, and then have like way cheaper threats, right? Like, yeah. I don't think that that's unheard of without, like, I feel like that's what I mean, though. Like, it's just reiterating that we haven't actually explored in a meaningful way these cards that, like, might be good. One, like, I know that we talked about Breakout. Everybody was really excited about Breakout when it first came out. It's red and a green for a sorcery. Look at the top card of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If it has mana value 2 or less, you can put it onto the battlefield and it gains haste. Blah blah blah. So it's like a free, like, tutor effect. But I'm like, I get that red and green is tough, but okay, what creatures do we actually want to put in play, like, that matter in Legacy that could be good? I mean, Jund has been, like, clamoring for a bunch of stuff recently, right? And it's like, Bowmasters is the best threat, and it's like, all right, do you want, if we have this plus Bowmaster as in any of the shells? Like, I experimented with Rock recently trying to make that work, and it didn't. But it was also because I played with a bunch of anemic cards that aren't good enough anymore. Yeah. But if I just removed the cards that were bad, replaced it with something like Breakout to get the good cards that were good, like, maybe there's something there. I want our listeners, before these Fallout spoilers come and take our attention and, lock us into something, I've been looking through the Karlov MANOR spoilers, literally, like, sleeping less, just because I'm thinking of the possibilities of what we could do here. And I urge our listeners to do the same. Also, I've been looking at, like, Filched Falcon and Deduce and all of these cards that investigate, and that has made me go back to Eldraine to look at bargain cards again. Yeah. Because now I'm like, oh man, like, is there a world where, like, there's just a bargain card that we're not realizing that's under the radar, that with all these, like, incidental tokens that you'd play anyway happens to be pretty strong? I was looking at, like, Farsight Ritual. I was like, can I just play with Dig Through Time and nobody else can? Yeah. I haven't tested it yet, but I'm now thinking, I'm like, 4 mana, I didn't think it was good enough before as a possibility, but I'm like, I mean, if I'm a Mystic Sanctuary deck and, I play, one of these and just bury my opponent, like, I Dig Through Time once, the game is over, right? Like,
yeah, if you do it
that seems
twice,
so
it's
good.
Kind of ridiculous,
Yeah, I was literally looking at, like, we're in the Beans deck, right? And I was, like, looking at the card Banish into Fable. You look at it on the surface, it's fucking trash. Sorry for, it's 4 blue-white for an instant that says bounce a permanent or bounce a non-land permanent, but then you get to copy it if you control an enchantment, and then you get to copy it if you control an artifact. So essentially, you get to bounce 3 things and make 3 2/2 Vigilant Knights for 6 mana. Now that's too much, right? Obviously 6 mana is too much.
Yeah.
But if we're in the Beans deck, and I've been trying to figure out, how do I limit my Entreat being a 10/2? And I'm, like, looking at this thing, I'm like, well, this is effectively Upheaval that then makes 3 2/2s at instant speed that have Vigilance and can hold down a Bowmaster. Like, I don't know. Are we in the space? Like, Filched Falcon turns it on by itself. Like, where are we at? You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I would never consider that. Like, on the surface, people are probably listening to me explain that card and being like, Phil, that's obviously trash. It's obviously gross. It's trash. Like, you can never play it. Has anybody cast it? Has anybody tried it? I haven't. But I'm, like, thinking, I'm like,
I cast this card during Standard when it was out as, like, this. There was a weird, like, there was a weird deck that played this. Of course, I was.
I'm just like, if I get to hold up all of my mana at all times, right?
Yeah.
And then when my opponent does anything, I'm like, all right, bounce your board, make 2 untap, make these 2/2s untap, take 6. They haven't. I don't have to tap them. So, like, if you try and I don't know, fucking 4th Aerolingus me or whatever, like, you got to do it for more than 3 because I got 3 tokens.
Yeah.
Like, I don't
know. You got to
like,
do it for at least 6, right? Like, because
it's like, if you're in that space, like, I'm like, oh man, should I just be playing, instead of my Entreat, should I just be playing this one of Banish into Fable and, like, incidentally be blowing people out because I can upheaval a whole board? You can also bounce your own shit, by the way. Like, maybe it's good to be like, oh, I want to reset my Narset, or I want to pick up my draw card off my Beanstalk, pick it back up, and then I can draw another card, and so like incidentally it cantripped an additional time, like
maybe
I
you
don't
want
know,
your
man.
Snapcaster Mage that you don't play anymore back in your hand.
I just keep seeing like all these possibilities of these cards that are incidentally enabling other things that I would have never considered ever.
Yeah.
And that to me is the mark of a set that's actually really good. Like Karlov Manor is making me think about cards that aren't in Karlov Manor in ways that I wasn't ever thinking about before. And that is so much more interesting. Like, okay, if I play against, somebody like slams an initiative creature against me and the game ends and it's really boring and it sucks. It's like, yeah, that sucks. Like that stuff isn't interesting. And the sets that have those kinds of mechanics aren't interesting. They're obviously broken and busted. They don't make gameplay any fun, and that's it. But then everything in Karlov Manor so far, I've been like, nothing is egregious, nothing is broken, everything is interesting. And if anything, I'm thinking about cards that aren't even in the set, but only because of the stuff that Karlov Manor has.
Yeah.
Like it has exceeded my expectations well beyond what we did for the review. And if anybody watched the review, I don't know if we like caught anything that anybody else didn't, but I just want to like do a whole nother set review of Karlov Manor, knowing what we know now, you know what I mean? And like reevaluating everything actually in context with like going way deeper now that I've had some experience with the play patterns.
Yeah. Karlov Manor, a 1 month retrospective.
I mean, but also it is kind of like, it is fun that like the shenanigans of disguise and cloak or whatever being like not good unless they give you an engine, a 1-card engine like Cryptic Coat. Yeah, that ability sucks. Like if anything, I was distracted. I was like, man, they're getting really lazy in design. They just they print better Cascade in one set, and then the next set they just power creep, morph, and manifest. Like literally back-to-back sets. Yeah. They were just like, let's take a mechanic from the past and power creep it.
Well, they were like, okay, how do we make Megamorph? How do we make Megamorph interesting?
But I feel like I was definitely distracted by the fact that I was like, man, that's really lazy, just taking mechanics from the past and arbitrarily power creeping them without any nothing else, just power creeping them.
Yep.
And then I'm like looking at all these other cards of like that are interesting designs that we weren't paying attention to and being like, this is fucking great. So anyway, I'll report back with my testing of Filch Falcon. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good spot to leave everyone off at is we'll get an idea of how these cards work going forward and report back. I'm gonna bring some decks to Chicago, so maybe I'll try Filched Falcon in what's it called, in 8cast. See if that gets there,
dude. You want to remember? Remember the last time we talked about a 1-mana permanent that draws a card? Do you remember what that one was?
No.
It was Arkham's Astrolabe. Now I get that Filched Falcon. Filched Falcon is definitely not. I know 100% it's not going to be as good as Astrolabe was, because Astrolabe, replaced itself immediately and then had an effect that was meaningful and affected your entire mana base construction. But I'm excited to play with a 1-mana permanent that draws a card like that. That is a rare commodity, and I'm excited to test it out. And it's blue.
Yeah.
So.
All right, well, there you have it. I guess we will catch you guys after I come back from MagicCon Chicago, and I'll report back in. We're gonna have a lot of content coming out that week, so stick with us, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for watching.
For the gift that keeps on giving all year round, join our Patreon at patreon.com/Eternal Durdles, and hey, check out this playlist we got up here with all of our interviews over the last couple of years. Some great people from the Legacy community, some really great guests.